September 14th, 1943, A347 hours, a forgotten rail yard outside Palermo, Sicily. The morning mist clings to twisted metal like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dozens of M4 Sherman tanks sit motionless on broken railway tracks, their steel hulls punctured by German anti-tank rounds, their tracks blown apart by mines, their turrets blackened by fire. This is where tanks come to die, where the U.S. Army sends its mechanical casualties to rust into scrap metal. But two men are walking through this graveyard with clipboards and flashlights, and they're not here to count the dead. Army clerks Harold Becker and Marion Voss have been assigned the mundane task of cataloging destroyed equipment for salvage reports. Standard procedure: fill out the forms, tag the wrecks, move on. Becker stops beside a Sherman with a gaping hole in its side armor. He should write "total loss" on his form. Instead, he kneels down and peers inside the damaged compartment. The transmission looks intact. The engine block shows no fire damage. The radio equipment is still mounted properly. "Marion!" he calls out, his voice echoing off the metal hulks around them. "Come look at this." What these two pencil-pushing clerks are about to do will violate every Army regulation about equipment disposal, challenge the entire military supply chain, and turn a cemetery of steel into the most productive tank repair facility in the Mediterranean theater. They're about to commit the kind of error that wins wars, the unauthorized decision that saves thousands of lives by putting broken machines back into the fight when the rulebook says they should stay broken forever. In war, mistakes usually kill, but sometimes they resurrect the dead. The Sicily campaign had ended 3 weeks earlier with Allied victory, but the cost in armored vehicles was staggering. Of the 2,400 M4 Shermans that landed with the invasion forces, nearly 800 had been destroyed or damaged beyond field repair capabilities. Standard military doctrine was clear: severely damaged tanks were to be stripped of useful components, and the hulks shipped back to depots in North Africa for eventual transport to American factories. The problem was time, and distance, and bureaucracy. Shipping a 33-ton tank hull across the Mediterranean, then across the Atlantic, then through the American industrial system, then back across 2 oceans and a continent. It could take 8 months, maybe longer. Meanwhile, Allied forces were already planning the invasion of mainland Italy, and they needed every tank they could get. The German Wehrmacht was regrouping, building new defensive lines, preparing for the battles that would determine whether the Allies could establish a foothold on Hitler's Fortress Europe. But Harold Becker had grown up in his father's auto repair shop in Detroit. He understood machinery. He could look at a damaged transmission and see not what was broken, but what could be fixed. Marion Voss had worked as a railroad mechanic before the war. He knew how to move heavy equipment, how to improvise solutions when proper parts weren't available, how to make things work when the manual said they couldn't. Standing in that rail yard, surrounded by what the Army considered irreparable junk, these two clerks saw something different. They saw potential, the mechanical equivalent of a second chance. The first resurrection began that afternoon. Becker and Voss selected a Sherman that had taken an anti-tank round through the left side of its hull. The projectile had penetrated the armor, destroyed the radio equipment, and killed the loader, but it hadn't touched the engine or transmission. According to regulations, the tank was a total loss because of the hull breach. According to common sense, it was a repairable vehicle with one hole that could be welded shut. They had no authorization to attempt repairs. They had no spare parts beyond what could be cannibalized from other wrecks. They had no proper tools beyond what they could borrow from the rail yard's abandoned workshop. What they had was determination, mechanical knowledge, and the kind of creative desperation that occurs when military necessity meets bureaucratic impossibility. The welding work took 6 hours. Voss had found an acetylene torch in the rail yard office and figured out how to operate the ancient equipment by trial and error. The patch wasn't pretty, but it was solid. The radio could be replaced later. The important thing was making the tank mobile again, capable of fighting again, ready to protect the infantry who would soon be crossing the Strait of Messina into a hostile continent. But one tank wasn't going to change the course of the war. As word of their unauthorized project spread through the camp, other mechanics began volunteering their time. Local Sicilian railroad workers, grateful for liberation from fascist rule, offered their expertise with heavy machinery. Within a week, what had started as 2 clerks fixing one tank had evolved into an underground restoration operation involving dozens of volunteers working in shifts around the clock. The second breakthrough came when Giuseppe Martelli, a Sicilian mechanic who had maintained locomotives for 30 years, examined a Sherman with a destroyed final drive. The official diagnosis was that the tank needed a complete transmission replacement, which would require shipping it back to a major depot. Martelli took one look at the damage and laughed. In his heavily accented English, he explained that he had been repairing similar mechanical problems on railway engines since 1910. The principles were identical. The scale was just smaller. Using parts cannibalized from 3 different tank wrecks, Martelli fabricated a working final drive in 48 hours. The repair wasn't by the book, but it worked. The tank could move. It could fight. It could protect American soldiers who would otherwise face German panzers with nothing but courage and inadequate equipment. Word of the rail yard operation reached Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison 3 days later, and his first instinct was to shut it down immediately. Unauthorized modifications to military equipment violated a dozen different regulations. Using civilian personnel to work on classified machinery broke security protocols. Operating outside the official supply chain disrupted inventory management systems that had taken months to establish. But Morrison was also a practical officer who understood that wars are won by results, not paperwork. When he visited the rail yard and saw 17 M4 Shermans that had been written off as total losses now running perfectly, his perspective began to shift. When he learned that his own tank battalion was scheduled to receive only 43 replacement vehicles for the upcoming Italian invasion, while the rail yard operation had already restored nearly 20 tanks in less than 2 weeks, his priorities became clear. Instead of shutting down the operation, Morrison decided to make it official. Sort of. He couldn't authorize it through normal channels, because normal channels would have required approvals that would take months to obtain. Instead, he used the military equivalent of creative accounting. The rail yard became a forward maintenance facility, with Harold Becker promoted to civilian technical advisor and Marion Voss designated as equipment logistics coordinator. The transformation accelerated. What had been a graveyard for broken tanks became the most innovative repair facility in the European theater. Techniques developed by necessity in that Sicilian rail yard would later be incorporated into official Army maintenance procedures. The concept of forward rebuilding rather than rear depot repair would revolutionize military logistics doctrine. But the most important breakthrough wasn't technological. It was psychological. Tank crews who had been told their vehicles were beyond repair suddenly found themselves reunited with machines they had thought were dead forever. Sergeant William Chen, whose Sherman had been blown up by a German mine outside Palermo, received a telegram 3 weeks later informing him that his tank was ready for pickup. When he arrived at the rail yard, expecting to collect personal equipment from the wreck, he found his Sherman fully operational with a new track system, rebuilt transmission, and fresh coat of olive drab paint. "I had written letters to my crew's families," Chen would later tell a military historian. "I had reported our tank as destroyed in action. Then this crazy clerk hands me the keys and tells me we're back in business. It felt like resurrection, like getting a second chance when you thought all chances were used up. The psychological impact extended beyond individual crews to entire units. Word spread that the written-off might be recoverable, that total loss might not be final, that American industrial ingenuity could triumph over German firepower through sheer determination and creative problem-solving. Morale improved. Confidence increased. The mindset shifted from managing scarcity to creating abundance through innovation. By October 1943, the rail yard operation had restored 63 M4 Shermans that had been classified as total losses. These tanks would participate in the Salerno landings, the battle for Monte Cassino, the liberation of Rome. Crew members who had been reassigned to infantry units were returned to armored divisions with vehicles that had been literally brought back from the dead through the unauthorized creativity of 2 Army clerks who refused to accept that broken meant unfixable. The irony became clear only in retrospect. The U.S. Army's official equipment replacement doctrine, designed to ensure proper maintenance standards and supply chain efficiency, had inadvertently created massive waste by discarding repairable equipment. Meanwhile, an unauthorized operation run by clerks and civilian volunteers had developed repair techniques that were faster, cheaper, and more effective than the official system. The contradiction forced a fundamental reevaluation of military logistics philosophy. If 2 clerks could restore 60 tanks in 6 weeks using improvised methods and cannibalized parts, what could properly equipped forward repair facilities accomplish with official support and adequate resources? The answer would reshape how the American military approached equipment maintenance for the remainder of the war. But beyond the strategic implications, beyond the tactical advantages, beyond the logistical innovations, the rail yard operation represented something more fundamental about human nature under extreme circumstances. When institutional systems fail to meet human needs, individuals create alternative systems. When official procedures prove inadequate, personal initiative develops better procedures. When bureaucracy becomes an obstacle to survival, creativity becomes a form of resistance. Harold Becker would spend the rest of his military career working in forward repair facilities, eventually rising to the rank of major and becoming one of the Army's leading experts on field maintenance procedures. Marion Voss would return to civilian life as a railroad mechanic, but he would carry with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important repairs happen outside the official guidelines, in forgotten places where broken things get second chances through the determination of people who refuse to accept that anything is permanently beyond repair. The abandoned rail yard outside Palermo was decommissioned in January 1944, its mission completed, its lesson learned. The facility that had been created by accident became a model for intentional innovation. The mistake that had violated regulations became the foundation for new regulations. The unauthorized experiment that should have been shut down became the prototype for authorized success. Giuseppe Martelli, the Sicilian railroad mechanic whose expertise had saved dozens of American tanks, was awarded a civilian service commendation and offered a job with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He declined, preferring to remain in Sicily where he had spent his entire life, but he kept the commendation letter framed in his workshop until his death in 1967. Local residents reported that he never tired of telling visitors about the autumn when he helped resurrect American tanks in a forgotten rail yard, when his mechanical knowledge had contributed to the liberation of Europe, when fixing broken things had become a form of resistance against the forces that wanted everything to stay broken forever. The lesson echoed through military doctrine for decades afterward. Sometimes the most efficient solution violates efficiency protocols. Sometimes the most effective procedure isn't in the procedure manual. Sometimes the most important innovations emerge from unauthorized experiments conducted by people who are supposed to follow orders, not create new possibilities. In a war where precision and discipline were essential for survival, success sometimes required the courage to ignore precision and discipline in favor of creative problem-solving. In a conflict where following orders could mean the difference between life and death, victory sometimes demanded the wisdom to know when orders should be quietly disobeyed in service of larger purposes. The M4 Sherman tanks that rolled off those improvised assembly lines in Sicily carried more than additional firepower for Allied forces. They carried proof that ingenuity could triumph over bureaucracy, that human creativity could overcome institutional limitations, that the difference between victory and defeat sometimes depended on the willingness of ordinary people to attempt extraordinary solutions when conventional wisdom insisted such solutions were impossible. Years later, military historians would analyze the RAILYARD operation as a case study in innovative logistics, a demonstration of field maintenance capabilities, an example of effective civil-military cooperation. But for the tank crews who received their resurrected vehicles, for the infantry soldiers who fought alongside those restored Shermans, for the families who welcomed home crew members whose lives had been saved by better equipment, the lesson was simpler and more personal. Sometimes what looks like a mistake becomes a miracle. Sometimes what appears to be violation of procedure becomes validation of principle. Sometimes the most important repairs happen to things that everyone else has given up on, including the belief that broken systems can be fixed, that discarded possibilities can be recovered, that hope itself can be restored through the patient work of people who refuse to accept that anything valuable should be abandoned forever. In war, certainty kills, but uncertainty sometimes resurrects the dead and sends them back into battle, stronger than before, ready to protect the living through the simple miracle of getting a second chance when everyone thought all chances were exhausted. If stories like this remind you that innovation often emerges from the margins, that creativity flourishes when conventional wisdom fails, then perhaps there are other moments of unauthorized excellence worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges require us to choose between the safety of procedure and the courage of improvisation in service of purposes larger than ourselves.